Well, welcome to the second Friday night at Egan. It's great to see such a large crowd tonight. UAS has been doing the Friday Night Egan program for about 10 years, and we feel that this is a great honor to have Dr. Marzluff tonight to talk about ravens and crows. And so it's really good to be here, to all of you to be here, and you're excited, I'm sure, about that. I want to talk first a minute. If you look out here, all of you, you can see, earlier today we dedicated this raven sculpture, which was done by Lisa Rickey. And I don't know if Lisa's come down. Is Lisa in the audience yet? We still have people coming in. But Lisa Rickey is a local young woman, or I'm going to say young woman, and Lisa and her family grew up here in Juneau, went to Juneau Douglas High School. There she is in the back. Lisa, she in the back? Nope. Michael, you're wrong. That wasn't Lisa. But anyway, Lisa was a student here at UAS and was commissioned to do this sculpture and was finished in 2005, and we dedicated it this afternoon. And I think it's a wonderful sculpture, and I would love you guys to give Lisa Rickey a round of applause for her work as a sculptor. Lisa was accepted to the University of Washington for her MFA and will be leaving this week to start her MFA. And it was really interesting to talk to her tonight. Her major professor called her this couple of days ago and said, "We have your studio ready." And if any of you were there to hear Lisa's story, I don't know exactly what that studio is going to look like, because she talked about how she had done this sculpture in her driveway, in her garage, and it outgrew her garage, so she went to Costco and got a tent and kept growing and growing, and of course grinding and welding in her driveway. But she finally finished this, which is about a 25-foot long sculpture. And she said she gave chocolates to all the neighbors after it was done to hopefully rebuild her relationships with her neighbors. But anyway, we want to also thank the UAS Alumni Association, who helped to pay for the sculpture, and they've done a great job over the years. So, and before introducing our speaker, I want to also introduce, is Blueberry, where is Sandy? Okay, can we introduce does he need more time? I want to introduce Blueberry the raven, who's here courtesy of the Juneau Raptor Center with her friend and handler, naturalist Sandy Harbinuk. So we're going to get Blueberry out, and it's been fun to have Blueberry here this afternoon. Quite the character. There you go. Oh. This is Blueberry, you guys. And I want to mention that Sandy, Blueberry, and Dr. Marzluff made school visits today, sharing their love and expertise of ravens with more than 280 middle and high school students today. And I really want to thank Sandy for volunteering her time, and of course as well as Dr. Marzluff for doing that. So thank you guys very much for everything you did. I also want to thank our two corporate sponsors tonight. Alaska Airlines provided the ticket for Dr. Marzluff to come, and Prospector Hotel is hosting Dr. Marzluff as a donation to the university, and I want to thank both of them for their help in doing this. And now we come to the main event. Dr. John Marzluff is Professor of Wildlife Science at the University of Washington, and he holds the Denman Chair in Sustainable Resource Sciences and directs the Urban Ecology program at University of Washington. His graduate and initial postdoctoral research focused on the social behavior and ecologies of jays and ravens. He was especially interested in communications, social organization, and foraging behavior. His current research brings this behavioral approach to pressing conservation issues, including raptor management, management of pest species, and assessment of nest predation. Dr. Marzluff has authored over 100 scientific papers on various aspects of bird behavior and wildlife management. His recent book, In the Company of Crows and Ravens, with Tony Angel in the Yale University Press, blends biology, conservation, and anthropology to suggest that human and crow cultures have co-evolved. And there are paperback copies of the book that are available for sale in the back, and Dr. Marzluff will be willing to sign them for you after the lecture is over. Dr. Marzluff has led studies on the effects of military training on falcons and eagles in southwestern Idaho, the effects of timber harvest, recreation, forest fragmentation on goshawks, and marbled murrelets in western Washington and Oregon, conservation strategies for Pacific Island crows, and the effects of urbanization on songbirds in Seattle areas. As you can see, quite a resume and an incredible person to have here. I'm really happy that all of you are here and going to get the opportunity to hear Dr. Marzluff. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. John Marzluff.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me okay? Great. I really appreciate you taking the time out of a Friday evening to spend and listen to some ideas about ravens and crows. Seeing this fantastic animal up here, it's a hard act to follow, that bird. So anyway, I hope to share with you some of my enthusiasm for this species and some of the various biological and cultural aspects that it has. But many of you in this room have much more expertise in these areas than I do, and I look forward to learning from you as well. First, let me thank everybody here also for bringing me here. It's been really great. It's a fabulous place to be. It's a great university to be at and to learn about the different programs here and the strong community that supports it. So I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. And I would like to again, start off with some basic biology of ravens in particular, but I will talk a lot about crows as well. The two species are very similar, and actually the first question we almost always get when Tony Angel and I present this presentation is, what is really the difference between a crow and a raven? So if I can get that to work. I wanted to start off with some of the basic characteristics. I've got some slides here, but this is the best model you're going to get of the differences, and you've already heard some of the vocalizations. And you all are so fortunate in Juneau to have both species here at all times, and you can really see and make this comparison. So I'm sure this will be nothing new for you, but in Seattle, we usually only see crows in the city, and if you're out in the forest areas, you only see ravens. And when you just see one at a time, telling the two apart can be a challenge at times. Vocalizations are one of the best ways to tell them apart. I mean, sounds like that a crow can't make. They can make things that sound somewhat like that, but basically crows caw, and caw often. And ravens quirk, or growl, or moan, or sound like dripping water, or exploding volcanoes, or just about anything you can imagine. I always tell people if they hear something in the forest and they have no idea what it is, it's one of two things. It's either a raven or a Steller's jay. And that's, 99% of the time correct. But these guys, the variety of sounds they make are a great cue, if you can hear that. If you just see the bird, of course, its size is twice or more the size of a crow. But again, seeing just one at a time, that's not so easy to see. The bill and the shape of the bill, and I think you can see it on Blueberry, but for those of you in the back, you can see here that it has not a very large crest of skull above where the bill comes out. And that, to me, has always been very diagnostic. A crow, on the other hand, has quite a different shape of a head. Here you can see here, it's a much taller distance between the bill and the top of the head. So just seeing one at a time, and of course that varies in the posture they're in, but it's a good cue. Crows are typically, not in Juneau, but typically found more associated closely with people, and they have a much deeper flapping wing style as opposed to a raven that's got a very narrow wing style and tends to glide and soar a lot, much more than crows, although that varies depending, again, on how they're taking off or landing. The shape of the tail of a raven is much more diamond-shaped if you see them from above as compared to the rounded, squared-off shape of the crow. But otherwise, they are very similar. They have the same multi-purpose body, and they have the same incredible brain that allows them to solve problems. And so Again, here you're just really fortunate to be able to see that difference all the time, and I hope you enjoy and celebrate it. The nest of these animals, again, is fairly similar. This is a crow's nest, but a raven nest would look similar, big outer bunch of sticks with some soft lining material in the case of a crow, vegetation, the case of a raven, hair of some prey species. They nest in a whole bunch of different locations. I'm not sure if they're the typical nest here. I would guess it's a tree nest, but they nest on human structures. They nest on lighting structures that are above sports fields. If you're a crow, you even nest on Safeco Field and on the structures there, but they nest on cliffs as well as trees. And they grow quickly. They start off as an extremely small, dependent animal. Here's a young crow, 5 hours out of the egg, just the size of the egg itself. You know, stretched a little bit when that egg opens, but a small raven will start off at this size, just 10 grams or so, and grow quickly over the course of several weeks. For a raven, about 6 weeks. For a crow, about 4 before they leave the nest. And when they're young birds, you can tell down here, ready to leave the nest, they're already have some serious attitude. They're ready to go. They're ready to take on the world. And they have blue eyes, which is how Blueberry got his name. The eye of a young raven or a crow for several months, maybe even 6 months, will stay this baby blue color. Really fascinating social signal in itself. Their mouths are also incredible. Bright red targets for the parents. And, you know, this is a brood in a pack that we brought out of ravens. And you can see why they want to make as big of a target as they can, because there's a lot of competition in that nest for the food. And they'll keep this color it could be for several years. It's a social signal, and it's an indication of subordinates to have a pink mouth. Blueberry's quite a dominant individual here, and has a jet black lining of his mouth. And you'll see that again as you're looking at birds around town. You can focus in on that when they're calling and see if that mouth lining is pink or black. And basically, if it's black, you're a stud, and if it's pink, you're probably a wimp. The posturing is also very indicative of their social status. And I bring this up because the social scene of a crow or a raven, although they have somewhat different social structures, it's very important to them. They are always signaling to one another. They are interacting with other birds all the time. And they are having to accurately indicate their expressions and emotions to these other individuals that they're dealing with, so that they don't unnecessarily fight or unnecessarily court or unnecessarily back away from an individual. So it's a very important part. Just like a pack of wolves or dogs, these animals do the same sorts of signaling. And for that reason, I think that's one of the reasons we're so attracted to them, is that we can read their emotions because they wear them literally on the surface. And we can understand a little bit about them. So in this case, the animal here, these two animals are really dominant birds. They've got what we call their ears up and pants down, and they are looking as big as they can possibly be to really intimidate anybody else. That would be a mated pair if you saw the two together, and walking like that and strutting like that around a food item. And in contrast, the animals up here are very subordinate. I can't get that mouse. The ones in the upper left, their heads are fuzzy, and they're cowering a bit even, and they're being in a submissive posture. And the ones in between here are in somewhat neutral postures. Well, let me back up a little bit and just put these animals into context for you. They're members of the corvid family, or the Corvidae, in the perching birds or songbirds. The raven is the largest songbird in North America and arguably the world. It's being challenged by the African raven at this point, but it's a big animal, as you can see, and people are often surprised that it's a songbird, but it has the complex musculature around its voice box to be able to make the incredible sounds it makes. But this includes also other members that you're familiar with here, the magpie, perhaps the nutcracker, the Steller's jay, and of course the crow and the raven. And typically we think of the jays as the more tropical, colorful animals, and the crows and ravens as the more northern hemisphere, darker, drabber members of this family. But they all share a unique set of characteristics. They're very generalist, a bill that can do a variety of things, incredible voice, and an incredible brain. So let me just take you back a few years and show you the way these animals got here. It's very relevant for those of you here in Alaska. But these animals crossed the Bering Land Bridge on and off over the last several million years. And they came across, of course, when there's more ice, there's less water, and there's more habitat for them to cross through. And so this slide shows this a little bit. So there are really two times of crossing. In the Miocene, somewhere between 6 and 10 million years ago, here, there were connections that are shown here by periods of low sea level, these dips below this line. Okay, so the jays crossed it sometime during that time. The tropical forest that was around at that time was more conducive to their ancestors coming from Asia and up through Siberia into the New World. And then later, somewhere on and off over the last 25,000 to a couple million years in the Pleistocene, perhaps the ice ages that we're more familiar with, that's when the Old World jay, the gray jay, and this is its closest relative here, the Siberian jay, and the nutcracker, magpie, crow, and raven came across. The interesting thing that I want to spend a little time with is to show you what was going on, particularly with the raven, because they have an interesting colonization cycle. So just looking at this diagram, the point is that the ravens, the common raven that we know, it's called the common raven, started to diverge from African ancestors somewhere between 2 and 4 million years ago. That bird spread throughout the Old World and came to occupy most of the northern part of the Old World. And then a couple of million years ago, as I said, it crossed the land bridge, and they became to diverge. The Old and New World common ravens began diverging. And this is indicated by DNA sequences that have been looked at to see how dissimilar ravens are from the Old and New World today. And we can still see that Old-New World split in the signature. The Old World raven spun off a Canary Island raven, which is now going to be classified as a new species. And the New World common raven spun off the Chihuahuan raven down in the Southwest desert, known for stealing burritos from young children down there. But what's interesting to this story, and it's a little complex, but it's really helped redefine how we view species and how speciation and evolution occurs in birds. And what we've seen is that there's another common raven invasion of the New World. And that happened during the Pleistocene, say 15,000 years ago as a guess. Birds again from the Old World came into the New. But remember, there was already an older Old World colonization about 2 million years ago. So now you've got this older New World raven that's been diverging. It's spun off the Chihuahuan raven. And now the Old World bird comes back again, maybe 1.5 million years later. And those birds now, which we can detect a difference in, are starting to merge. So they were diverging and perhaps were creating two species, one new and one Old World raven. But with this recolonization and now continual gene flow among those two types that exist here, we tend to see a blending of that was what going to be a diverse two species into now one species. And that's shown in this last pie chart here. It shows the different genetic types that we catch here in North America. And if you go in Europe or Asia or anywhere in the north, including Alaska, you get only the Old World ravens, the genetically signature of the Old World raven. But in the southern part of the U.S. and southwestern part of the U.S., you get mostly this newer, or actually, sorry, the older invasion, the 2 million year old bird. And in Washington and Idaho, you get both. And we have pairs on the Olympic Peninsula, one of each genetic type that are paired together and breeding just fine. So my point here, not to belabor it, is just that the speciation event that was probably occurring between Old and New World birds has been truncated because of more recent invasions of Old World birds here. They've now become merged, and we don't see a new species here. We instead see two species that were becoming diverse now becoming blended again to one. So this process of how species are formed back and forth is really an ongoing dynamic thing, and that's the ravens have been able to teach us that. So there are many faces of the raven. The sleepy face over here is going to get in his crate and take a break. But we know them in many different ways. You know them here as really spiritual motivators, cultural drivers. But early people saw them primarily as utilitarian and pragmatic. They would use them to clean up the cities. They would use them to indicate which way to go if you're navigating at sea. and they would use them in a variety of very useful ways. We also see that they're an interesting scientific subject, even in an evolutionary case, as I was just telling you about. And they're also viewed by some people as pests, and they're of conservation concern because they eat other birds that are relatively rare. So I want to touch on some of these and just introduce you to a little bit of the fascination with these birds. And I'll start off first with a little bit of their interesting biology in the winter, and then go into some of the potential concerns we had with them eating marbled murrelets, and then end up with their interaction with people and really this back and forth coevolution that John mentioned. So first off, take a step back to a place where it doesn't rain quite as much. This is the part of Maine where Bern Heinrich and I studied ravens in the winter. And this is a nice area that shows the typical landscape they live in, and the darker areas, the evergreen areas, are the type of roost that they use there. And we were interested in learning how they came to be grouped together at an animal kill. So what Bern had seen, and what you may have seen around here, is when you're out away from the city in a concentrated source of food, you rarely see groups of ravens. You might see 2 ravens flying down the highway or way back in the wilderness where they're looking for food. But the only time you'll really see a group is around a food source. And in our case, in Maine, it was a dead moose or dead deer that really brought in a group of ravens. And so we were trying to do experiments on this. And the only way you can experiment on this is to put out a dead moose or a dead cow or a dead sheep or whatever you could get. And so this graph just shows you the dynamic that happens at a large animal carcass in Maine. And what you see here is the number of ravens on the y-axis and the days after we put a dead animal out in the forest to see what would happen on the x. And at big carcasses like a cow, and again, I would recommend, if you're interested in ravens, to put a dead cow in your yard, and you could see this same sort of thing. It would probably take a while before they started to feed on it. You can see in our case, it took about 7 days before the black dots start raising up. But then a large group of ravens will occur, and that large group comes quickly. So there's nothing, and then boom, a big spike in the number of birds. They eat the cow, and then they go away. The same thing happens at a deer, just more quickly. So if you have a small yard, you could use a deer. But either way, you will see a few birds, and then a large pulse in birds, and then a drop-off in them. And what we deduced that was happening there was aided by the use of radio telemetry. So we put radio tags on the back of ravens and followed them around as they discovered and then fed upon these large animals. And this diagram shows basically what happens. First off, there'll be a pair at the food. And that's typically the territorial pair that lives there and has found the food on their territory first. And they will defend that from all comers. They don't say anything about it. They try to be quiet and keep it to themselves, as you would expect. We were concerned or intrigued by the fact there were so many birds there. Why would they share this information? Well, the pair doesn't. They try to defend it, but then a young bird will come in, and it'll find that food, and it will try to access it. And the way it tries to access it is to grovel and beg and make a lot of noise around this food. And then other ravens will hear it, and they will gather until you have a small group, that 5 or 6 or 7 birds around there. Then the magic happens. They go back to a roost where they sleep communally together, and at that time, there's enough motivation in that roost somehow for all of those birds in the roost to follow a few individuals the next morning, and they go and they eat that large moose together. So then you get this big party at the moose. So there is active information that's being exchanged at these communal roosts of ravens, and one of the pieces of information is where food is that's just been found. Now, whether it's a particular call or a dance or whatever, we don't know. I'll show you the next slide that suggests one of the things involved. But what could just very simply happen is if you know where food is, you just go to there in the morning. And if you don't, you hang back and follow somebody who's going. And again, with 5 or 6 birds all going the same way, it'd be more attractive for all the others to follow and cause this large group to develop there. But there's also some interesting social soaring that happens. And I've heard some of this described here tonight from folks here. And ravens will soar for a variety of reasons. They soar simply because they can and because they like it, I'm sure. And they'll flip around in the winds and really have a great time. But they also soar to indicate a shift in the roost location. So after a carcass has been discovered and the group hasn't fed there yet, the birds that are back of the roost will soar all around, and they will often move to a new place closer to this food source where they're going to feed the next morning. So it reduces commuting costs, but it also gives a large signal to the whole community of ravens to join this group that's soaring and move with them to a new place. So it's some combination of those and perhaps even more active calling that we don't know yet that causes this buildup and sharing of food. But again, why should animals share? Well, maybe they're closely related. That was one thought. And it makes sense from Darwin's perspective to share with your relatives. They share genes with you, and so helping them is really helping you indirectly. Well, we tested that. And what's shown on the left side here are the DNA sequences of ravens that are found feeding together. And the only thing to note there is that there's not much similarity. In contrast, these two panels on my right are panels of siblings. And you can see that the banding, the color, where those dark colors line up are pretty similar. So they're not closely related. These are unrelated individuals. And what we found by marking hundreds of birds and watching them use these carcasses is that these birds that are sharing information are young birds that don't yet have mates, and they're coming from a huge area, hundreds of kilometers, and they're continually mixing and rejoining and reforming around different foods. So it's not a stable group that has some inherent property. It's just a collection of birds that happens to be hungry at the same time. The important reason, I should say, why it's beneficial for them to share is that by having numbers, young birds in numbers, the adults quit defending the food. And so they just simply overpower these powerful adults. And they do that just by attracting others in. All right, so now let's take a completely different shift here and look at some of the potential conservation concerns of these animals. And this is from work my students and I have done on the Olympic Peninsula, which is the outline map here, the northwest corner of Washington State. And the little bluish area there that looks kind of like a pig in profile, that's Olympic National Park. And what we did is we radio tagged ravens and crows there and followed their foraging bouts and saw where they went. And the little circles or black spider-like things are either crows if they're open circles or ravens if they're filled. And what you see there is that birds that live far away from people, these birds all nested more than 5 kilometers from people. Those ravens, they just kind of go all different directions. Those little lines out from the circle indicate where we had them go. And the open circles tend to be more directional. They fly towards really high food places like cities like Forks or waste transfer stations that occurred there. Some of them fly directly to the prison, the correctional facility there, because the prisoners really enjoy interacting with crows and ravens, and they feed them all the time. So there's a lot of food available. So crows are making long commutes back and forth to these foods. Ravens are just expanding their ranges. And we were concerned then that perhaps some of these places where food is provided might be artificially increasing the population. And that might have detrimental effects on other species. So this is a messy slide. It's got a pretty simple story, though. And that is you get a reduction in the time before a nest is preyed upon, which is the y-axis, as a function of the number of corvids, crows, jays, and ravens that we counted there. So areas that had a lot of crows, ravens, and jays that attracted them in to these food sources tended to spill over an effect and have those birds prey upon other nests that are there. And these were marble murrelet artificial nests that we made to test their influence on that threatened species. And what we saw was that Steller's jays actually were the most important corvid playing this role, that their numbers were locally enhanced by our activities, and especially our fragmentation of forests and providing picnic areas there. And those had spillover effects to the viability of murrelets that were nesting there. Ravens and crows certainly did some of that, but they were much less abundant than jays. Maybe the same thing you see here, and therefore they had a less of an overall impact. All right, so that's some of the more biological things. Now I'd really like to shift gears and have you start thinking about how these animals have influenced us. And as John was saying, we think that we've influenced them as well, and this is a reciprocal and ongoing sort of relationship. And that's what I'd like to explore with you a little bit here. So this drawing, again, all these black and white drawings that you see were done by my co-author with the book, Tony Angel, a local artist in Seattle. And what Tony's portrayed here is just a copy of a stone diagram from Lascaux, France, that's about 30,000 years old. And this diagram is intriguing in many ways, but what I'd like you to focus on is the shape of the head of this guy who's laying on the ground. And it's very much like a raven's bill. It comes out right from the top of his head, as I was saying to you earlier, and it's about the right proportion for a raven's bill, not a stork or an eagle or something like that. The idea with this diagram, how it's been interpreted, is that the person laying there is actually the soul of a hunter who's been transformed into a raven and is being moved to the next plane of life. And it wouldn't be unusual to come upon a scene somewhat similar to this in the forest. You can imagine hiking around and having been out on a hunting party, dispersed hunting party perhaps, and one of your colleagues has been killed by a bison like this that was gored, or that gored it. And all of a sudden, as you find this dead comrade, up from it would fly several ravens, or maybe crows. And that association of crows and ravens with death, including our own death, throughout the millennia, has, I think, shaped a lot of our views of them. And they were, of course, considered harbingers of death, not only early in our life, and perhaps as those that would move our spirits, but as also evil aspects of death, as shown here with the disguise that the plague doctors would wear in the Middle Ages during the Black Death in Europe. And they would wear this gown and this raven face when they came to the house of a person or a family that had the plague. And they would condemn that house. This is not the person you wanted to see knocking at your door. I mean, he's kind of a handsome-looking guy there, but the reason they wore this raven face was, of course, to symbolize death, we think, but also it served a function. They put perfume in that bill so that the doctor didn't have to smell the death that was in the particular house. And also they had thought at that time the disease was passed through the air, as opposed to, as we know now, with fleas. I'm sure you can all think of a variety of words, sayings, and things like this that have been motivated by crows and ravens. As we look through the English language, we found no other wild animal that had motivated our language more than the crow or raven. So you see here a crowbar, a macaw dancing mask of a raven, transformation mask of a raven, and the scarecrow over there. Different ways they've motivated our culture and our language. Edgar Allan Poe with his famous poem, of course, about the raven and a broken-hearted young man. And you can think of other sorts of words. When you're hungry, we typically say we're ravenous. When you're going to go directly somewhere, you go as the crow flies. I think I took out the slide that shows how a crow really flies, and just in case you're wondering, it's not a straight line. They get easily distracted along the way. But many, many words, crow's feet, crow's nest, all sorts of things derive from these animals. And even other legends derive from them. And Tony's shown here in this timeline of their influence, many different ways that they have influenced our culture. You're very familiar with the Tlingit and Haida cultures here that have been influenced greatly by their interaction with these animals. I assume there are ravens in the audience listening to this. And that's been a fabulous bit of transformation of human culture, but it's not unique. There are similar things that have gone on in Scandinavia with their Norse gods, Odin in this case illustrated at the top there, being informed by two ravens daily about the goings-on of the world. Asian artists were greatly influenced in the Edo period here by their interaction with crows in Asia and viewing them as kind of the common man struggling against the oppressing leaders. And even in more recent times, dramatic influences on our culture, Hitchcock's, The Birds. And if you just listen to Hollywood these days, when something bad is going to happen in a movie, there's typically a crow calling or a raven perhaps quirking, but usually a crow. And we have modern sports teams named after them, Baltimore Ravens. We have rock bands like the Counting Crows that are named after these species. So they continue to influence us in many of the similar ways, perhaps not as fantastic as they've influenced in the past, but they continue to have this effect. So as I said, for example, the Haida belief that the creator raven was the one who let the first humans out of the clam cell is shown here in Bill Reed's wood carving from the Vancouver Anthropology Museum. Others don't view this animal quite the same way. So this is another view of crows and ravens. In this case, it's a crow hunter. And crow hunting is a popular sport in the lower 48. I guess I learned today from some of the students we talked with that it's also popular here. And you can shoot crows, but not ravens. But they're a challenging target, and because of their challenging abilities, they've caused a lot of the evolution, kind of an arms race between crow hunters and crows. So the crow hunter here has got camouflage. He's got a special gun. It's a high-powered air rifle. He's got probably electronic crow collars that he uses to bring the animals in so he can shoot them from a distance so they don't get alarmed to him. Crows, on the other hand, have a set of weapons they've developed to counteract this. And one of those is the ability to recognize and remember this guy's face. So I want to tell you about some of the experiments we've been doing in Seattle, where we've been trying to understand if crows can observe people and remember their individual faces. We always thought they did. When we would catch birds for our experiments, we'd have to catch them in a net and then hold them, band them, and let them go. We didn't hurt the birds, but we always felt like they knew it and remembered it, because when we'd walk around after that, they would follow us, they would give alarm call vocalizations to us, and they would interact with us in a very different way than before we caught them. So we thought we might as well test it. We wore this caveman mask when we caught 7 birds on the University of Washington campus. And then we recorded their behavior when we wore this mask after we caught them, and we compared it to this mask, which we did not catch them with. But as you can see, it's not an easy discrimination task. But in this case, we used the vice president as the neutral face and the caveman as the negative face. And this graph just shows you what the crows did in response to this. So the way we observed these animals was to just walk through an area where we had caught birds wearing one of those masks, or no mask, and record how many of the birds we encountered scolded us, dove down at us, attracted others in to surround us and give harsh calls at us and follow us around. And that's the y-axis, the percent of the birds we found that scolded at us. Before we did any trapping here, the birds basically ignored us, regardless of what mask we wore or if we wore none at all. After trapping, they ignored us when we did not wear a mask and when we wore Dick Cheney as a mask. The students didn't ignore us, but the crows did. If we wore the caveman mask, though, up here in any of these forms, with a hat, just by itself, just the hat, or upside down, which is a good test of whether they're really responding to the face, they scolded us in all those cases. And if we had people over here who'd had no idea what we had done wear the mask, they got the same result. So this was a nice experiment in that we could change our face or keep our face constant and change our bodies and everything else about us. And they responded to the face. And it lasts a long time. So here's the number of birds, again, scolding on the Y, and this is the number of days after we caught them on the X-axis. And it goes up to 600 days here, but I can tell you that we're approaching 3 years right now. We're past 800 days, and this line's going up. So the number of birds that are scolding us on campus has increased. And remember, we only caught 7 birds. Most of the birds that are scolding us are not the ones we caught at all. So they have learned socially by observing one another scold us, or observing when we initially caught those birds, to hate the face of the caveman. That's important for the story of how they relate to people, because it allows the development of a tradition to occur in an animal. A socially learned behavior is what we refer to as a tradition in animals. And this is a socially learned behavior, to hate the caveman mask on campus. The reason they can do these sorts of things is that they have big brains for their body size. You see the size of Blueberry's head. And this diagram that Tony did of a skull shows the skull of a raven to the left here. And here's a cormorant here, a similar size bird, a fish-eating bird that you see around here that's not known for its intelligence. Has a relatively small brain case relative to the big brain case of a raven, and a crow next to it. And this graph just shows this for you. And it basically shows the size of an animal on the Y versus the size of their brain on the X. And in general, big animals have bigger brains than small animals. That's why you have these sets of lines going up from small to large. And fish have smaller brains than the other vertebrates I've shown here, which is good if you like to fish. You don't feel so bad. But still, big fish have bigger brains than small fish. And birds have, on average, bigger brains than fish of any size. And mammals are bigger than birds, and primates, of course, have the biggest brains of mammals. But look where the crows and ravens and even these large parrots, the macaws, fall. Well, right on the mammal line and even up on the primate line. So really, when you look at a bird like your crow or raven here, you're really looking at a flying monkey. It's a monkey in feathers. It's got a brain that's equivalent in its size to a small primate. And because of that, they can not only remember us, but they can solve pretty complex tasks. And I want to show you a video here of a crow, a different kind of crow, Betty, who's a New Caledonian crow. She's from the islands in New Caledonia where there are no woodpeckers, and the birds there, the crows in this case, have learned how to use tools to get at food that woodpeckers would normally get with their stout bills. And she was brought into captivity from the wild and given the task of given a straight piece of wire and asked, pull that bucket up out of the tube with this piece of wire so that you can access the food that's in that tube. She did it very successfully. These little tools that she made are shown down below her picture, and I'll show you a video of her making the 7th time she did this experiment. But you see the same thing here with your crows along the beach that are dropping clams. They fly to just the right height. Physically, fly to the right height where the mass of that clam will crack when it hits the ground, and they're close enough to be able to get right on it when it bounces and not be lost to something else. So it's not random what height they fly to. If you give them different weighted clams, they'll fly to different heights, lower for heavier clams. So here's Betty getting ready to do this task. And I just want you to watch it and think about the sorts of decisions she's making and the sorts of information she's using to solve this problem. She's just got a straight piece of wire, trying to use friction at this point. Didn't work. So think about what she had to do. She made a tool, which isn't that unusual. This species of crow makes tools. Ours don't make a lot of tools. You might see them use a sharpened stick to probe something. But that bird makes a tool for a living, so they're good at doing that. But she made it in a pretty complex way. She used a lever by sticking it and wedging it in that tape and walking around, to get another use of duct tape that even crows know. Walked around, made that tool in a very effective way, and then used it to get the goal that she was going after. So I really don't think there's any other way to explain that other than she used insight to understand the problem, make a tool that was appropriate, and solve the problem using that tool. And that's not something, insight is not something that many scientists would have ascribed to birds for sure very long ago. But now with examples like this, we're seeing that birds are very, very good at solving complex problems. So this idea then of these abilities of the animal, the smartness of these animals, their ability to respond to us, led Tony and I to suggest that perhaps some of their social traditions have been influencing our social traditions, and our traditions, again, influencing theirs in a more mutualistic or ongoing coupled change. So that's what we call this cultural coevolution. And I just want to give you some examples of that. We think it occurs in many different places and where these birds interact with us. Certainly, urbanization, and I would put Juneau in that class, shows that sort of close interaction of birds that are living in a city with people probably learn all sorts of things and then influence us, again, in their abilities so that we change our behaviors as well. So the human aspects are pretty easy to document. I've shown you a bunch of those changes in our cultures. And here's just one more example. This is a macaw woman. Tony drew it from a photograph we had that was taken in the early 1900s or late 1800s on the Olympic Peninsula again. A macaw woman at a salmon drying rack. And built into that rack on the far side here is a scarecrow in her likeness. So not only were these people worshiping Raven as a creator, they were also battling Raven as a thief. And maybe that's why we have these dual stories of tricking and also powerful creation stories by this animal. But they were dealing with the raven in many different ways. And the behavior of ravens was probably responding. Perhaps they were recognizing the difference between a scarecrow and a real person. Or perhaps they were recognizing that if they went at certain times, they could get food more easily. Those are harder to document. I showed you the one with the human face recognition, and I'll show you a couple of other examples that I think are pretty good documentations of socially learned traditions in these animals in response to their interaction with us. So the first one is here. It's by research that was done by Rick Knight and his colleagues in Wisconsin and Washington. And what Rick found was that in urban areas where crows and ravens are both protected, you're not able to shoot them in those areas because of other policies, really, for discharging guns. They're very aggressive when you go to their nest or if you approach one of their young birds. They will dive and swoop at you, and maybe some of you have had that experience here. We certainly do in Seattle with the crows. In a rural area shown on the far side, where the birds are persecuted and perhaps hunted, they're much, much more wary. So they've changed their defensive behavior, and in the rural area where they're occasionally shot, they leave and they stay away. And I saw this in my experiments with the recognition of people. In my neighborhood, I have some neighbors who don't like crows, and they shot 3 of them during my experiments. And it's happened before. And the birds there, you're lucky if you can get within 100 meters of a crow in my neighborhood without it flying away. But in downtown Seattle, of course, they'll walk right up to your feet where they're protected. Same thing here with nest defense. Agriculture, they've responded to very strongly. They've influenced our culture by having us develop scarecrows. And this idea of a scarecrow is long-standing. This pot here is from the Mimbres culture in New Mexico. It's a 1,000-year-old representation of a crow trapper with 3 nooses here and crows hanging on a fence above his cornfield. A couple other crows walking away, probably learning what was going on there and staying away from these fallen comrades that are a very effective scarecrow, still the most effective scarecrow. So they've influenced our culture for a long time, but we've influenced theirs with agriculture by providing a strong food source, corn in particular in the U.S., that has allowed crows to move further and further north. In fact, may be responsible for some American crows that have made it to Alaska now and are perhaps to the detriment of what was a unique species, the northwestern crow. So these animals have followed our plows north into southern Canada. Because of that, they had to start migrating. So that culture of migration for northern crows is in response to our culture of planting corn further and further north. Whether that's influenced our corn planting techniques, I don't know, but it certainly influenced our protection techniques. And then lastly, I think one of the best examples comes from Japan. And this is an example where the social mechanism for learning is pretty well understood for these birds. And it's a complex back and forth between people and crows. And so it starts off with Japanese people planting English walnuts in their city of Tokyo. And those walnuts, of course, are a really nice food item, but they're really hard. If anybody's tried to crack walnuts, especially black walnuts, it's hard. It's too hard for a crow to be able to crack in their bill. So what the crows have done, they took that as a new food source because it's really valuable. Maybe they started dropping them like you see our birds here drop clams, but what they've done is they've started to use cars to crack these nuts. And so what's shown in A is a crow with a walnut in its bill, and it goes to an intersection. It waits for the lights to turn red, the cars to stop. It flies down. I'm not kidding you. This is true. Flies down and puts that nut right in front of the car's tire. It then goes back up and waits for the light to turn green, the car to run over the nut, and the next red light, it goes down and eats the cracked nut. Very satisfied, as you can see with the guy over in B. So they've learned this very intricate foraging behavior and using people to open these nuts. And it's a socially learned trait from all we can tell. The map up here shows the spread of this trait. It was first discovered in 1975 here in the bottom corner of this diagram. And in 20 years, each of those contours are years. To 1994, it had only spread a few kilometers from this initial site. That suggests that birds are watching each other and learning about this technique from their parents or just seeing other birds do it. It's not sprouting up all over the place. There was one big leap there in 93 to a new spot, maybe a disperser or maybe a new innovation of the same behavior. But that's the kind of data you need, and it's hard to get those sorts of data to relate it back to a human behavior that's caused this. And then I asked Higuchi, the professor, what are people doing now in Japan in response to this? Because this has gotten a lot of play in PBS type of shows. And so I asked him, Hito, what do these animals, or what do the people do now in response to this foraging behavior by crows? And I kind of expect him to say, well, they try to run over the crows. But he didn't. He said they really make an effort now to run over the nuts that are in the road. So they've shaped the driving behavior now of the people. So there are lots of stories that we have heard over the last couple of years that suggest these sorts of things that occur. And I'd be really interested in hearing those from you. But let me just run through a couple of these really quickly, just to give you a hint of the sorts of things we've heard about. In Sweden, a woman emailed me last week to say that her mother used to feed magpies. And the magpies would look in the window of her house. And when they saw her, they would ring the doorbell so that she would come out and feed them. That was kind of cool, but they didn't like the father because he would always argue with the mother about feeding him, and he didn't like feeding the birds, and he'd chase them away. So they would poop on his car when it was parked outside. And even if he moved his car and he switched places with his wife, they'd still get his car, never hers. We've had stories of crows and ravens bringing gifts to people. Maybe you've experienced this. I mean, I've had a lot of stories of this where they'll bring shiny objects, natural objects, but also the first one I heard, which blew me away, and I'll just leave it to you to think about, but a guy in Seattle, a chef, nice guy, seems like a perfectly sane person, feeds crows every day, and after doing this for several months, he looked at them and he said, I feed you guys every day. What do you ever do for me? And the next day, at this place where he feeds crows, was one of those Valentine hearts with I love you on it. I don't know how I'm going to publish that in the scientific literature, but we'll get it in somehow. And I saw the heart. I don't know where it came from, but we've had crows dropping red and white missiles on people, stepping up on people and handing them things that, crows don't normally do that. But it's not uncommonly reported, so I give it the benefit of the doubt. They fight with weapons. This is a report actually from my thesis advisor and published in the scientific literature of a Steller's jay coming to a bird feeder where a crow was, ripping off a branch because the crow wouldn't move, took a branch and used it as a sword in his bill to poke at the crow. And the crow just turned around and grabbed it from him and chased him off with it. So you want to be careful who you chase. Opening beer cans and other sorts of, they open anything we store food in. We know this. But beer cans. In the Queen Charlotte Islands, ravens there have taken to grabbing beer and puncturing it with their really stout bills and then drinking the beer. I don't know why they'd want to do that, but turning on heat here, there are lights. I think your lights here are under these same. This may be from Juneau. I can't remember if it was Juneau or Ketchikan. But the ravens in the wintertime, when it's cold, of course, go and stand on the light sensors on the lights so that it appears dark, and the lights turn on and heat up their feet. And the last one there of returning trash, there's lots of cases where they steal our food. And I'm sure you guys have been victim to this, as we all have. But in this case, there were two men playing golf, and they had their sandwich stolen by a crow, which, again, wasn't that amazing. But 2 holes later, the crows brought the sandwich bag back to them and gave them the trash back. So why they would bother, I don't know. They have a conscience. So these animals influence us in many ways. They've influenced us in our culture, our religions, our language. They've influenced us perhaps in conservation ways by causing declines in some rare species. And I'd just like to leave you with one more thought, and that is that we have affected them as well. Not only have we affected them in positive ways, like we see here in Juneau and other places in the West where crows and raven numbers have increased dramatically in response to our activities. That's, we can enjoy it or you can view it as a pest. But in other places, and in this case in Hawaii in particular, we've caused the demise of several species of crows. So even though we think of them as the ultimate survivors, some of them don't make it with us. And so what Tony's drawn here, the top one is the American crow, the bird you're familiar with. The second crow down is the alala, or Hawaiian crow. And that bird is now extinct in the wild. There's about 60 individuals in captivity. They're breeding them in captivity with the hopes of eventually re-releasing them to the islands. But we were studying them only 15 years ago in the wild, and now they're gone. And that's because of a combination of things we've done, most of it innocently. But when we brought mosquitoes in bilge water from boats in the 1800s, and then mosquitoes shortly thereafter, that combination of mosquitoes with the bilge water, and then malaria and avian pox as diseases later with pet birds, that combination has been deadly for most of Hawaii's avifauna. Over half of the species of birds in Hawaii are extinct now. And the Hawaiian crow is just the latest animal that's close. These other two crows are also from Hawaii, and they are extinct. They're only known from fossils. Tony's redrawn them here based upon the amazing fossil skulls that exist of these animals. And they went extinct shortly after Hawaii was colonized by the Polynesians. We don't know why, what sort of changes were brought, but it just serves to show you that crows and ravens can be vulnerable. Many live on islands where they're in relatively small populations, and they're threatened by any change in their environment. Fortunately, that's not the case here on the mainland, and we can enjoy their more creative aspects, and we can enjoy that interaction probably for a long time with them, but not so in places like Hawaii. So I would end with that and be glad to take questions and other discussion with you. I would wish that you see 12 crows at sunset, because 12 crows at sunset is good luck. So if you're counting, stop at 12. Don't go to 13. Even if there's more there, just pretend you didn't see them. Thanks a lot. I guess you have to use the microphone so that they can hear you. Everybody can hear you.
Well, thanks. And one thing I'm wondering is you showed a big picture of many species of corvids, and there was this one that had a crest and a very long tail. What was that?
This guy's going to be trouble. It's a magpie jay. It's an awesome bird. It's in South America, and it's in the tropical rainforests of South America. There are several different species that are like that. Big, long tails. They're colorful, black, blue, white, and a big crest as well. Kind of a hybrid, it looks like, between a magpie and a jay, although it's not. But it's similar features of both of those species. So great question.
Thanks.
You're welcome. She's got to hand this.
Have you any comments on beak deformation in corvids?
I don't. Some of the kids were asking about it at the high school today. I talked to Sandy Boyce earlier tonight about it, and I don't know. We don't see it much at all. It's a big deal up here. I'm sure why you're asking, but we don't know what caused it. Is it a mutation? Is it some kind of a contaminant? I don't have any idea. We occasionally see birds with really long upper mandibles. And, physically it's caused by them not occluding correctly. And therefore overgrowing. But why that happens, I don't know. I don't think we've got the answers yet to know that. But there are lots of people working on it up here, and I'm sure they will get answers for us. But I don't know. Yes?
I read Ravens in Winter, and
Yes.
I think I remember the author saying that we should be careful not to anthropomorphize behavior of ravens or crows.
I didn't do that, did I?
No, I haven't finished yet. I lived in Seattle, and I experienced this gift kind of thing, and so I'm wondering, is it thought to be giving thanks or asking for more, or does anybody have any idea what that is?
I can only tell you that, I would be interested in what gift you got.
Well, it was a little piece of meat.
So we've had, and that
I
makes,
was leaving Seattle and I defrosted my meat and put it out, and I'd been feeding the crows in the neighborhood for some time. And I put the meat out, and then I was taking garbage in and out, because I was going to leave. And it came outside, and there's right outside my door was this little pile of meat.
so I mean, they could have just put it there by mistake. They could have given it to you as an offering. It's easier to see when they do something like that. I've heard that with people getting dead baby birds from crows that they feed a lot. They'll leave it, kind of like your cat might bring it in and show you, this is what I did. So whether it's intentional for you, it's hard to say. There are cases where it's clearly intentional for a person, where they come and they give it to the person, and I have reports of that. So I would believe that it was intentional. Was it thanks or was it asking for more? I don't know. Not a clue. But I'm going to raise that issue, with all these different stories that come out like that, just to see what people think. I mean, I studied with the guy who wrote that book. And, I know what Burnett would say. He'd say, yeah, they're giving some kind of reward back to you for having rewarded them for all this time. Now, whether they do it when there was no excess food, don't know. So there are lots of, it would be a really fascinating set of experiments to do in a more controlled setting where, with birds like blueberry and others that are in captivity, that you could really start to see what are the characteristics associated with that kind of behavior. Until we do stuff like that, it's just going to be fascinating, but hard to understand fully, for sure.
I was wondering, do ravens eat other birds' eggs?
Yes, they love other birds' eggs and their babies. So they are very opportunistic. They have a huge diet. They'll eat just about anything, but if given a choice, and we gave them these choices a lot, they will take an egg over just about anything, and any kind of egg. We tried ostrich eggs. We tried very, very tiny eggs. They like them all.
Okay.
We had a raven in the neighborhood that several of us were concerned about because he was getting very close, and obviously asking for food, and so we were all feeding him. He had the light eyes and he had very light gray fur. Was he a young one?
Yeah, almost certainly. The light eyes, it would have to be, although if it had the gray plumage, then it may have been a partial albino, which again is not all that uncommon. And there are neat legends about white ravens and being very, very important totem animals. And I've seen one like that. It's usually a socially subordinate bird as well. So the fact that it was begging and soliciting food might not be all that surprising either. Yeah.
Yeah, I have some stellar jays that show up on my porch and stare at me until I throw them peanuts. Mm-hmm. And then they fly around and I see them, they store these peanuts like squirrels.
Right.
And I was wondering if that kind of hoarding or storing behavior has been observed in ravens and crows.
Yeah. What we call caching or hoarding behavior, it's very common in all the corvids. And it's extremely well developed in species like Clark's nutcrackers, which store hundreds of thousands of individual pine seeds every year, and they remember where they put them. And they recover them through meters of snow or, in plain ground. And that's a tightly co-evolved relationship between the pine and the bird in that case, where the pine has produced a very nutritious seed that can't get dispersed without the bird moving it around. And the bird's developed a long bill and a special pouch to carry it in, and a spatial memory that's unrivaled in the animal kingdom to be able to find those seeds again. So Steller's jays are kind of low down on that scale, but they can do it. When I first got in Thursday, I looked out my hotel window and there were some crows right outside there, and one had a piece of bread, flew right down to the median in the highway and stuffed it in the ground, and then reached over and grabbed a big chunk of grass and stuffed it right on top of it. And they do that all the time. So they cover up their caches so others can't find it. Squirrels and crows go back and forth battling to steal each other's caches. It's an interesting behavior. Yeah. But it makes sense when the kind of food these animals deal with is boom or bust. So they're able to store food for lean times, and they're able to survive a lot of lean times without eating as well.
I noticed when Blueberry was out, much of the time he or she held his beak open. Why was that?
It was hot. So birds don't have sweat glands, and instead they cool by opening their mouth and letting that mouth lining, which has lots of surface area and moist surface area, evaporate off heat. So they were able to cool themselves. Maybe he's a little nervous with, Blueberry's had a long day of visiting kids. So.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. And I just wanted to ask some more questions. You mentioned the study where you were interested in predation by ravens on marbled murrelet nests,
Right.
and that you used simulated nests. So I have two questions. I want you to elaborate a little bit more on that. And then my understanding is that there are very, very few marbled murrelet nests that have actually been located. And so if ravens are good at finding their nests, maybe a trained raven could help find those nests for research. But if you could tell us a little bit more about what is known about that predation and whether it sounds like it's a pretty serious population level pressure for the murrelets.
Yeah. I think the biggest population level threat for them is Steller's jay predation, just because there's a lot more Steller's jays. And they have been recorded preying upon actual murrelet nests. Steller's jays have, as have ravens, but mostly Steller's jays. So the way we did that, they were, as you point out, this is the last nest of a bird in North America to be found, terrestrial bird. And that was in the 80s, 1980s. Their first nest was found because they just lay an egg, an exposed egg, and it's on a large horizontal branch with moss, the sorts of old growth branches we have here. And they don't defend it very much. The adults lay the egg, they incubate, of course, but they have to forage far away, so the egg's exposed at times. The chicks are basically left there for the day while the parents are out foraging at sea, bringing back fish. They're a unique seabird that nests in a tree, but has to forage and fish at sea and bring food back and forth. So what we did is we took Easter eggs, and we painted them to look like murrelet eggs, and we had radio transmitters inside of those eggs. And we climbed up into the old growth trees and put them up in places where murrelets nest. And we recorded them from the ground then when they were disturbed. So when the egg was pecked by something, it was coated with wax and it left a mark on it. Or we also put chicks out there, small chicken chicks that were dead that had a transmitter in them. And when they were moved, the transmitter would give a different signal, and we could then climb up and see what happened. And we could look at the marks in the wax of the transmitters to see, was it a bird bill? Was it chewed by a squirrel or something? And we found that flying squirrels are also a very important predator, as are mice, small mice that live up in the trees. It's a kind of a deer mouse that lives high in the canopy. And I had several students follow up on this, and we tried, because there were two things that were a problem with that. Nobody was surprised that ravens and crows were predators. We knew that. But they were surprised when we said mice and squirrels were, and especially flying squirrels, which are the main prey of spotted owls. So there was a little tension there, in that I was saying we need to get rid of flying squirrels, and the owl biologists were saying, no, we need a lot of flying squirrels. So we had to make sure that they were indeed predators. So we gave them exposure to live pigeon chicks that we also put up in the canopy of the old growth, and they attacked those as well. And they were very effective at it. They're predators for sure. So we found 13 or 14 different species that were predators on those nests. And of that whole assemblage, Steller's jays are pretty important. And it's certainly, in terms of a land manager, it's the only thing a land manager, Forest Service in this case, or private timber companies can deal with, because they can't do much about what's going on at sea with prey populations, which are certainly important for that species, fish populations. But on land, there were two basic strategies that our results suggested to make the nesting habitat higher quality. I mean, it'd be great if we had more of it, but that's going to take hundreds of years to grow more old growth. But of the remaining old growth, there were two situations that were good for nesting success. big blocks of old growth like Olympic National Park or other preserved areas. And as a federal manager, they could deal with that. Forest Service could deal with that in some of their ownership. But a private timber company couldn't really have that as an effective solution and still make any money. So the other solution is to have small patches that are far away from any human activity. So the worst situation we found were small patches of old growth that were right next to picnic grounds and other areas where people spend a lot of time. So our suggestion for timber companies was if you've got small patches of old growth, that's fine. Make sure they're far away from people if you're going to invest in those as conservation targets. Don't invest a lot in these small fragments of old growth that are already by high human activity. They're going to have the lowest contribution to the murrelet population. If you're a federal manager, big chunks is what we need. And if we had that mix on the landscape, it would probably be good for murrelets, or at least hold them. They're still definitely declining, and they're definitely a rare species. So it would be great if we could do a lot more for them. But at least in this situation, there's a couple different management strategies that would pay off. Did that answer the questions?
Thank you, yes.
Couple more, and then I'll be glad to sign books and answer your questions back in the back. And Blueberry's going to come out, I think, again back there, so you can get a good close-up look at that bird. He's really impressive.
What's the evolutionary benefit of having this large range of vocalizations, especially when they're mimicking other sounds?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can imagine a variety of different uses for this vocal repertoire that they have. It's probably larger than it needs to be for basic function, but they are a social species, and they have different vocalizations that are used in crowds versus intimate conversations with their mate. They mate for life, and they form these long-lasting bonds, which are probably reinforced by vocalization. And perhaps there's also individual tagging of the mate or other individuals that they interact with that is served by having a diversity of calls. I was going to point out with the bird, if he had made a lot more noises, they have some pretty unique noises that he may be the only raven that makes that particular noise. And so that and mimicking might be some of the sorts of uniqueness that they use to recognize each other in their comings and goings, might be part of it. The kind of basic functional groups that they have are related to danger and food and basic communication that you can understand. But the mimicking of dripping water and barking dogs and crackling fires and phones ringing, I don't have a clue why they do that. If anybody knows, I would like to know. But it's almost like they can't help themselves learning these things and repeating them. They use these vocalizations in so many ways, some of which may not have an evolutionary function. It may just be they can do it, and they've got the time to do it. So it doesn't necessarily have to all be evolutionary significant, but there are many parts of the calls that are, and the calls are graded in their intensity to indicate emotion. They're graded in their frequency, the pitch of the call to indicate emotion. Of course, the same call given in different contexts has different meanings. And each call that we know of has a unique individual signature like our voices. So that even if there wasn't tagging calls for particular people or particular birds, they would recognize each other by those sorts of variations in their voice, the sound. So there's an awful lot of information in any of those calls. And, I don't think it all has to be adaptive. A lot of it is.
I have a question that is maybe simple and maybe not so simple. Do ravens or corvids play?
Yes, easily. And many different ways. It's hard to explain an animal that slides down a roof or a snowbank and gets up and does it again as not playing. I mean, maybe it was getting parasites off of its body, but I don't think so. I mean, they do some amazing things like that. I've seen, and you've probably seen some of these sorts of things, but wheeling in the air, now that could have some display characteristics like I showed with the soaring to indicate the change of roost. But they do it an awful lot of times also just, in apparent fun and flipping around because they can do it. And it must be stimulating to them. But one thing to keep in mind with a lot of what we interpret as play, and kind of getting back to the comment over here about anthropomorphizing that, a lot of that could have function also. And one thing about crows and ravens is, at least for the corvids, they're very social, and they're being watched by lots of other birds in almost anything they're doing. Some of these vocalizations, some of these behaviors that we see as seeming to have no function except fun, they might just be showing off to others that are watching. I'm serious in that. And that could show potential mates or rivals, yeah, this is a pretty tough bird. It's vocally superior, it's physically superior, I'm not going to mess with it, or I'm going to mate with that bird. So there's an awful lot of scrutiny by members of the society about all the things these guys are doing all the time. So a lot of it may simply be that. But I think they play. I think they do some of those things that's hard to explain any other way. One more.
Two questions and one comment. You're talking about play out in the Aleutian Islands. You'll see the ravens get up and they roll down the roof sideways. So they have a line. Yeah. And they roll on one after another.
And a ticket.
Yes, exactly. Two questions. I was working out in the Aleutians, and there was a raven out there with 2 white feathers in one wing. Mm-hmm. He did not socialize with any other ravens at all. Is that part of the flock protection type of thing? He's an outcast, and is that standard for the bird?
They can get white wing feathers in a variety of ways, but one of the ways is through being injured. And an injury to the area where the feather's growing would cause it to be white the next time it grows out, or as it's growing out. So that bird could have just been socially subordinate, really subordinate, and attacked a lot and led to that injury. It may still have had some effect of that injury. I would say it's that more than the coloration, because ravens, it's not uncommon to see them with fully changed plumages or to have bits of white, and I've seen them interact. They're commonly subordinate, but they do interact with their species. They breed with mates. So I don't think it's so much of just an outcast as that it might have been something else with that bird that caused it to be socially subordinate and been outcast.
Second question, has there been any studies on the colonization of the oil fields up north by the ravens? Yeah, I didn't mention that, but student at University of Alaska Fairbanks has been studying that quite a lot, and we've been studying in colonization of oil fields in Wyoming. Some of my students have been, and they both show the same thing. And that is, there are areas, in our case sagebrush, in your case tundra, that don't typically support big populations of ravens because they don't have nesting structures there. So as we put out oil or derricks, other structures that are associated with the removal and transport of the oil, we provide nest sites for these birds. And they nest out there in great abundance, and then they can access the animals that are there. And in that case, they've been having a negative effect on Steller's eiders in the North Slope, which are a fairly rare duck. And these predators now are able to move further and further into an area where they couldn't before. And of course, they also use food that's dropped by workers out there and the same sort of things that occur in urban areas. I would say in the North Slope, it's been pretty dramatic, the regulations they've put into place for oil field workers to not leave any food around, to not have containers open, much like your policies here in Juneau. And oil workers are fired if they violate those rules immediately. So it's a pretty serious penalty. They've taken it seriously, and they've tried to reduce the impact, but it's certainly a factor. Yeah, also they use the flare stack areas for when they stay around winter. They don't migrate out in the winter. They use flare stacks for heat.
For heat, yeah. So yeah, we've done, like most places except some of the islands, our activities are real beneficial to crows and ravens, and they take advantage of it wherever it is. They can colonize over huge distances, so all we have to do is change a few things like that, and they're right there, and they're very successful when they get there. Yeah, thanks.
Well, let's thank Dr. Marzluff for a wonderful presentation.
Thanks a lot.
And again, we have Dr. Marzluff's latest book in the Company of Crows and Ravens in the back. We have those sales, and if you would like him to sign it, they're there. I also want to take a moment to thank Patrick Brown, the Dean of Arts and Sciences, and his staff, particularly Margaret Ray and Heather Hadley, for helping on this area tonight, but also for the whole Friday night at Egan that will be coming up all throughout the fall. They've done a lot of work and really appreciate that. And then having a large group like this, I can't not at least give you an opportunity. We do, I love ravens, I love birds, my family does. My wife's kind of a birder, and she's gotten our two granddaughters into it. And we have a special fund that actually was created by Jim King, Sr., who many of you know here, who really worked his whole life with research on birds. And that fund is called the UAS Bald Eagle Coastal Rainforest Ecology Fund. And it was established by private donations. We've had other donations to it. And ultimately, his goal was to be able to have an endowed chair here for avian biology here at UAS. And while we're working on that endowed chair, that fund provides student hire for bald eagle coastal rainforest ecology-related projects, student scholarships for biology, environmental science, fellowships related to the bald eagle, support of visiting professors, contract work for bald eagle coastal rainforest kind of projects. And so if any of you are interested in giving to that fund, we have people from our area, from our development area here, or you can contact our development office in the Chancellor's. And that provides us an opportunity to do research on birds in the future. So anyway, again, let's thank Dr. Marzluff, and we'll do it. And thanks again for coming. Thanks again, and good night. Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started. Wow, great crowd. I really appreciate everyone coming this afternoon for the dedication ceremony for our raven sculpture out in the courtyard. And for those of you who have not had a chance to come up after we finish this, it's a great view of the sculpture. As somebody said, it's a bird's eye view, so that's kind of nice, you know. I didn't say that, but I stole that joke, but it is a bird's eye view from here, and the raven was painted last week, and it's beautiful, in terms of the way it's turned out this week. So I apologize for not having it outdoors, but when we were doing the sun dance this morning, it kept raining, and we were a little worried about it raining on everybody, so we moved indoors, and of course, as would be the case, then it's not raining. But thank you all for being here this afternoon. This has been a great beginning to the year this year. Some of you have heard me on the radio and you've seen some things in the newspaper, but we had the largest freshman class we've ever had. We had 158 students at our orientation, and it was they filled up one whole side of our gym bleachers. It was just a lot of fun to have them. They engaged all of the 2 days of orientation. They stayed engaged and were excited and having fun. And so it's been a great kickoff. And I think this is a good addition to that to give some more energy to what's going on this fall here at UAS. One of the things that I wanted to give you an update, the many of you have given to various things here at the UAS campus as we've made improvements, like the pavilion, the UAS pavilion that's up on the hill, the Auk Lake Trail, which is under construction right now, and will pretty much be completed this fall, although it won't be finished. We're the latest, unless the snow stays away, we're kind of fighting the fall a little bit in terms of when the snow hits, but it'll be pretty much done by the end of the fall, but it'll have some more work to do on packing the trail and plantings around the trail. So, but that's coming along. I'm really excited about this whole evening here, and I wanted to introduce our special guest before we get into the dedication ceremony. And Dr. John Marzluff is here from the University of Washington, expert on ravens and crows, and he has written a number of books, and his latest one, In the Company of Crows and Ravens. He will actually be signing these later on, and wonderful book. And this is an opportunity for you to hear his lecture and also to talk with him afterwards. He'll be around all evening, so it's great to have him with us as a special guest. What I'm going to do now is turn this over to Alice Tersteeg, who, to be honest, was a big part of us deciding to do this raven. I'll tell the first part of the story. I was up at Fairbanks, and I saw Marshall Lynn, who was then the Chancellor at Fairbanks. I was up there for a meeting, and I went into the library because I wanted to see the renovation had taken place at the Rasmussen Library. And lo and behold, there was this raven there, and it was made out of rubber, and it was about, I think, 6 foot long and maybe a couple feet tall. And ravens happen to be my favorite bird, and I love observing them and watching them and hearing them. They wake us up almost every morning where we live, and they're just such characters. And so I said, wow, this would be incredible for us to have a raven on campus. So I came back and I called Alice, had her come over to my office, and we started talking about it. And I was talking about, well, isn't there a way we could get a raven sculpture? And so I'm going to stop there and let Alice tell the rest of the story, and then we'll get back to the dedication. Alice.
Thank you. It's not a short story. It went on for, I'm going to make it very short, but it went on and on because the artist was very wonderful, very gracious, but somehow months turned into more months, and somehow nothing was happening, and she was having to move, and then things weren't quite working out, and she didn't know where she'd be able to do it, and finally she sort of just disappeared. We weren't hearing from her anymore. And I went to John and I said, she's a wonderful artist, but I don't think this is going to happen. And so John said, well, what are we going to do? Because you can see how enthusiastic John is. Once he gets his thoughts around something, he's ready to go with it. And I said, well, we have a wonderful artist right here who's one of our students, and she knows how to weld. And I'm sure if we were to, bring her into this, she's a very versatile artist. At that point, most of what I had seen was work that she had done in some of my classes and some of the other art classes. And she'd created some huge abstract sculptures. But knowing Lisa, I thought, oh my gosh, she can do it. If anybody can do it, she can do it. So John and I got together and talked this over a little bit. And John, I just really appreciate what you did, because the Alumni Association went out and found money, and lots of people donated to this. And most of all, Lisa went through the ringer on a lot of aspects of this, but it happened, and it's gorgeous. I mean, I'm sure all of us have raven stories, and the first raven that was ever on this campus, is the totem pole with the raven at the top that's just a little ways from here. And that certainly speaks to the more traditional aspects of this community. But what John was thinking was something that would appeal to another element or another aspect of our appreciation for ravens, and it sure does. Lisa has done a wonderful job, and I started teaching for the university in 1973, and as you can imagine, I have been on a lot of committees, but let me tell you, this one is one of the most enjoyable ones I've ever been on. I just thought this was a wonderful committee to be on. So if you ever need to volunteer for art selection, I'm here. I just love it. You know, I can't tell you how much I enjoyed that, and trying to help Lisa get over some of the obstacles that were in her way. But I think we need an inside story. And the story goes on.
And so let me introduce the artist herself, Lisa Rickey. And Lisa is a 208 graduate of the University, 207 graduate of the University of Alaska Southeast. And Lisa has been accepted to the University of Washington MFA program, and she actually leaves this week to go down. And she was just telling me that her major professor called her and said, "We have your studio ready." And of course, when you say that, that would fit into this whole thing, because we don't exactly have that kind of studio space for a bird this big. So Lisa can describe some of what she went through in order to do this sculpture. So anyway, if we'll all honor Lisa Rickey, who is the sculptor for this beautiful piece of art.
There's a lot of people here.
Now you're going to have to
Oh,
talk
I
right
don't wanna
into it.
talk.
I know you don't, but
And
I'll stand right next to you.
And I stopped at the eye doctor on my way, and Dr. Beffel put these things in my eyes, so I'm a little blurry and I'm a little teary. Anyway, I just want to thank the university for this opportunity. It was a huge project for me. It stretched my bounds on what I was doing. And it started out in my garage, and it soon grew. And I had to go out to Costco and buy one of those giant, big garage things. And I put it in my driveway and moved out there. And it kind of grew out of that. And the big, huge beak was sticking out for months. It took me a year to build it. And my neighbors were all really, really gracious with all the grinding and cutting and so forth. And I took them all a big box of candy when I was done, and it was fun for all of them to watch it grow, so it was kind of a neighborhood thing. And I chose the name of Loki because it was Loki's the trickster god in the Norse mythology, and the ravens around here are also kind of trickster and scampish, and what I wanted to remind us is that a certain amount of chaos is needed to move things forward. And that's kind of what they represent to me. And anyway, it took me about a year to build the raven. I did a lot of sketching. I went to Costco parking lot with a lot of breadcrumbs and studied what they were doing. And I went to the dump a couple times, but they kicked me out. So tried to confiscate my camera. But I really enjoyed learning a lot about ravens. I did a lot of studying and tried to find any videos I could with the crazy things that they do. And and I wanted to thank the people that helped me. I had a friend from Canada. His name was Ken Rothney, who helped me with the structural part of this. I had to do a lot of balancing and how this bird was going to come together and could it hold up, and that was a little beyond my scope, so he came and helped me, and my good friend James Crawford helped me with some of the building, and I had a lot of support from my family and my kids, and they're here to say And what else? Liz Dodd helped me write this as I'm running out the door. I've been dealing with carpenter ants. I just got my roof on yesterday. And I'm leaving on Sunday, so it's been kind of a hectic week for me. And Liz Dodd, who's an English teacher here, who's a good friend of mine, she couldn't make it because she's in putting the trim molding on my floor. But she helped me write this as I'm running out the door, so I just want to thank the people. Alice has been such a great support for me when I was in the program, and Jane Tersteeg also. They have a great art program here. And I thank John for coming to me that day about the raven and showing me that big rubber raven. And he just said, build a raven, and I got artistic license. I got to do whatever I wanted, so I made him kind of a caricature. And what a lot of people didn't know is I actually put electric red lights in the eyes. And I had this little battery, and I came out, someone came out, it was one of my kids, or not on Halloween, they flicked it on. But there were so many lights that you couldn't see it, and the battery has since died, but that was my little secret. So, thank you. I'm glad that part's over.
Well, I knew there were lots of pieces to this, but I didn't know all of the stories about how it grew. You can imagine it's sort of like the guy who builds the boat in his drive, and just the one he's going to sail around the world. We've seen those and just grow and grow, and I'm sure it was kind of like that. So it was still. And Lisa did not mention her father is sitting next to her, and her sister Maya is here, and her brother Doug is out of town, so he's not here. Oh, and then sister Alice in the back, yes. And the kids, the two boys are Tony and Andy are in the back. And thank you all for being here and supporting your mother, and thank you for supporting her while she went through this, because I have to admit I never had commissioned a sculpture before and had no idea what I was doing. And so Lisa put up with me too, as trying to work our way through, and the university working its way through. Carol Griffin is in the back, and I remember going to Carol and saying, how do we do a contract for commissioning a piece of art? And so we went through all of that kind of stuff too, but it was a learning experience for all of us, and it was wonderful to be able to do that. I do want to add one thing. Ree Munoz really wanted to be here today. She was invited, and she had to leave town, but she sent me some comments to make to you, Lisa. And she called to say she regrets she cannot make it to the dedication as she's out of town. Wanted to pass on to you, the Raven sculpture is the most beautiful sculpture in Juneau. And she said whenever she has guests visiting from out of town, she drives them to the university to see the Raven sculpture. So that's really neat. And now I'd like to turn it over for some comments from the Alumni Association. The Alumni Association was key in being able to bring the funds together to create this sculpture. And Jerry Burnett is here representing Bob Mitchell, who called early this morning, got sick and couldn't be here. And I want to just say something about our Alumni Association before he gets up here. Our Alumni Association has been recognized now statewide as the most active and very thorough in terms of the way they deal with the university and being able to raise funds and help us to be able to do extra projects. They've raised funds here for scholarships, they've given to the pavilion, to the trail campaign, to this sculpture. They've just done a number of things, as well as developed their own endowment for their operating funds. And for a very small alumni association, it's a remarkable accomplishments. And so I want to thank them personally for that, and that they have in the university let you know how much the university thanks you. And so Jerry, if you want to make some remarks.
Well, thank you. As John said, I was asked to speak for Bob Mitchell because he's the president of the Alumni Association Board, and he was ill today, so I'm the treasurer. And I just want to make a few remarks. We're just thrilled to see the Raven sculpture out here as the board. And this year, or this past couple of years, we gave $25,000 to the Auk Lake Trail. We gave $10,000 in scholarships this year. Another $7,500 for the handicap accessible van for the university, and another $10,000 for a trail and catch camp. And people might not think about that, but they've started a chapter of the Alumni Association in Ketchikan, and it's been contributing to our growth. 8 years ago, there were only 79 active members in the Alumni Association. Now there's over 400 dues-paying active members. So it's grown a lot, and it's been due to the commitment from the university, from John and his staff, and it's been due to the hard work of some of our board members. We do a lot of events in the community. We had a couple of golf tournaments this year, one in Gustavus and one in Sitka. We have an annual event at a Mariners game in Seattle. And so if you're from the University of Washington, feel free to join us next year. I'm sure we'll find a place for you. Well, they didn't win when we were there this year either, but they tried. They scored plenty of runs. The other team scored a few more. Anyway, the other thing that's happened here that we're pretty excited about is there's a student alumni association here, which is developing, we hope, future leaders, and people will have a commitment from the community. The Alumni Association really is, it's an outreach, it's a liaison between the community and the university, and a way to keep connected. I graduated from the University of Alaska Southeast twice, 1987 and 1988, and this is the third university I've been to, so it's a little late here, but our members, our board members, are many of them community leaders. Bob Mitchell's an investment officer with the Department of Revenue. I happen to be the deputy commissioner at the Department of Revenue. And many of our members are community leaders, and so I just want to encourage people to join us, to see what our events are, and join us at the wine tasting in the fall, or one of the golf tournaments, or one of the one-on-one programs we do. Thank you.
Okay, now we come to the dedication. So there's actually an official dedication. Did you know this, Marshall, that they actually have an official dedication? We found this out as we went, so we get to do it. I don't know, I feel sort of like a priest or something, and maybe I'm supposed to bless it. I'm not clear. I'm going to look at it while I do this. I'll move it this way. And Lisa, maybe you should stand up here with me while we dedicate it, so that we can can really be official. The only thing with that we won't have is some holy water to put on it, unfortunately. But yes, champagne bottle, that would be even better. Okay. Friends and colleagues, by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Regents of the University of Alaska, I dedicate this sculpture in the Morant Plaza and commit it to the achievements of mind and the challenges of new understanding. May all who walk by or pause here to reflect bring still greater contributions to the advancement of knowledge, the spirit of learning, and the abiding sense of community that defines the University of Alaska Southeast. Well, I moved it that way. I want to thank all of you for coming, and I encourage you. There's a donor reception of our alumni and friends after this is over with. There are also tonight, as we said, at 7 o'clock, 7 p.m., lecture, and my understanding is Blueberry going to be at the lecture with you too. We will have the live bird, who is I think Sandy Harbinuk keeps the live raven named Blueberry, who's apparently quite a character, and Dr. Marzluff used him today in the schools. He went out, and I think 280, we visited, I think, something like 280 students in the schools today, Dr. Marzluff and Blueberry. So I really welcome you to be here and come to the lecture. It's going to be a great lecture, and we're really looking forward to it, Dr. Marzluff. So that would be wonderful. So well, again, thank you very much, and we appreciate you all, your support for UAS, and hopefully your continued support as we move forward. I will give you, they didn't put this on here, but I have to do it. Our big project this year is we are fundraising for an eagle totem pole. We have been given a yellow cedar log by Sea Alaska, and we now are going to be raising the additional 100,000 plus for the carving as well as for the setup of the pole. We have not picked an area yet. We're working with the Aquan. We haven't picked a story yet. We're working with the Aquan, and one of the elders, Marie, I know you're here tonight, Marie Olson, who's an elder. She's working with us as well as other elders and members of the Aquan. And we are going to have a story completed by the end of this fall, and we will be going out and getting proposals from carvers to carve that pole. So if you're inclined to give to the arts, this is a great project that we've started. We've already had a number of donations, but we welcome many more because we still have a long way to go with our fundraising. So anyway, I give you another opportunity. So thanks a lot again for being here.